838. Again, that's page 838 in your Blue Art Scroll Chumash, or in any Chumash, it's chapter 19 of the book of Numbers. So let's begin with the overview of this week's Torah portion. We're going to have the laws of the red heifer, which we'll explain a little bit. Then we're going to have the famous story of Moses striking the rock to produce water. Then we are going to have the story about some kings that did not allow the Jewish people to cross through their land on the way to the land of Israel. And then we're going to have about the passing of Aaron, the high priest. And then we're going to have a story about fiery serpents that attacked the Jewish people in the desert. And then we're going to have some more stories of interference in the passage of the Jewish people on their way to the land of Israel. But let us begin with the actual name of the Torah portion, which is Chukat. So we've discussed this before, but just to briefly review it, there are three commandments can be divided in many different categories. So famously, there's commandments between man and God commandments. Love your neighbor as yourself, don't steal, don't kill. Those are man and God commandments. And then man and God is like tefillin or Shabbos or kosher and so on and so forth. But another way to distinguish different commandments is edut, chukim, and mishpatim. Just to review it quickly, mishpatim are the rational commandments. Everyone understands them, so much so that the Talmud said we would maybe figure it out on our own, even if God didn't command us to do it. So like honor your parents, don't steal, don't kill, and so on and so forth. Then there are edus, testimonial, things we do to testify to Jewish events in history, like eat matzah on Passover, eat on a sukkah on Sukkot, or even keep Shabbat, to testify that God worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh day. And then finally, there's this category, chukim. There's a whole category of commandments like kosher or not mixing wool and linen garments that are commandments given that we don't know the reason. We do it simply because God commanded us to do it, and so we do it strictly out of obedience and adherence to his will and trust in his commandments. And the Torah portion begins with such a commandment. It begins with para aduma. In biblical times, in temple times, when someone was spiritually unclean, which is another category of chok, that you become ritually unclean when you come into contact with a dead body. And again, there are reasons given. A dead body is devoid of a soul, and therefore it lacks the holiness of the body that it was permeated with during its lifetime, and therefore the vacuum of holiness, the absence of holiness creates impurity, which radiates from the body to anyone who comes into contact with it or even is in the room with it. So if a person went through a burial, a death in their family or in their loved one, and now they have to come to the temple, they have to cleanse themselves. And the Torah says take a red heifer and take the skin and burn it with the ash, mix it with water, and you sprinkle, the Kohen sprinkles it on the person who is contaminated, and they become cleansed. And this is the ultimate chok. Even King Solomon says it's beyond my understanding. Having said that, a couple of practical lessons we could learn from this super rational commandment, that the entirety of the commandment is beyond our understanding, but yet there are lessons we could learn from it. And yes, the rabbis have delved into it to try to understand whatever they can grasp in this commandment. But one opening idea is that the Kohen, who was the one who administered this sprinkling, would cleanse the person who became unclean. But in the process, he would become unclean because he came into contact with the person who was unclean. And the message of this is, just like a doctor sometimes runs the risk of catching an infection from the patient that he's treating, but is willing to jeopardize or even sacrifice his own health to administer healing to someone else. The Kohen on a spiritual level did the same thing. He was willing to become unclean just to help someone else become clean. And this is a very high level of love of your fellow man, because it means that even when it's to your disadvantage, if it's a win-win, I help someone else and I get benefit at the same time, then everyone's happy. Or even if I don't get benefit, but at least I help somebody else. But if I'm going to lose in the process, and not just lose physically, but lose spiritually, because I'm going to become unclean, that is the extent a Kohen is willing to go. And that's an example for us that even when something may cost us, so to speak, or harm us in some way, that is even something you should be willing to do. Because the ultimate good is greater and worthwhile. And being that today's the third day of Tammuz, the day of the Yartzeit of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, I think this is one of the messages that the Rebbe taught his followers. He said, go out to remote communities and spread Judaism. And today there are thousands and thousands of Chabad emissaries all over the world. And some of them go to very random places like Montana or Alaska or, New Zealand or wherever it may be, all over the globe. And in many, many cases, they come to a community where there's no structure of Judaism. There's no school for their children. There's no mikveh for their wives to go to. There's no synagogue to pray at. And they have to start building from scratch. And sometimes it could take years till they create these institutions. And a famous story of a Chabad rabbi, when in the early years, when the Rebbe sent emissaries, he went out, and then his father passed away, and he had to say Kaddish 3 times a day. So he wrote to the Rebbe, should I come back to Crown Heights? Because I don't have a minyan in my community to say Kaddish. And the Rebbe said, no, you're reaching out to other Jews to teach them about Judaism will be a greater elevation for your father's soul than saying Kaddish. Stay where you are. And that's what Chabad rabbis do when they live in remote communities that they can't get a minyan every day. Maybe they could get once a week, maybe twice a week. Maybe they can't get it even once a week. But they stay and they don't say Kaddish. And you say, what do you mean? Every religious Jew knows you say Kaddish. Every Jew knows that. But there's a greater good, a greater purpose that I have to serve. That's a very powerful message unto itself. The second message is that what happens, you take the ashes of the red heifer. Red represents life. Red is blood, passion. And now it's reduced to ashes, death. And what do you do with the ashes? You mix water. Water represents life. Everything grows from water, living waters. And you mix the living waters with the dead ashes, so to speak, with the remains of the carcass of the animal, the red heifer, which was red, full of power and passion. And you blend it together and you sprinkle it on the person, they become cleansed. And again, this is a metaphoric message that the person who's consumed with grief and sadness over the loss of their loved one, the message is take the water, take life and imbue it in the ashes. And that's the way you will find comfort. That's the way you will be able to carry on even after your loss. And again, this is a very powerful message, and we know this is very true in life. When people grieve tragically over the loss of loved ones and life, the best way to heal is by saying, okay, how can I take my grief and channel it through something that will add life in the memory of my loved ones, something that they did. And that is the continuity of their life. Even as I mourn their passing and I focus on the ashes, I say, how can I take living water and mix it with the ashes so that their life can carry on? And this will give me comfort. It's a famous story when there was a terrorist attack in Israel in one of the Chabad communities, and the community was devastated. And they wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, through your continuous building, you will be comforted. Through creating life, that's the way you're comforted over the loss, the passing. So that's another very powerful message about the paraduma, the red heifer ritual that is described in the beginning of this week's Torah portion. But there's one other lesson that I would like to share from the story of the red heifer of the paraduma. There's a famous story in the Talmud about a non-Jew by the name of Dama ben Nesina. And the Talmud says if you want to know how to properly honor your father and mother, you could learn it from this Gentile by the name of Dama ben Nesina. What was the story? The story was that his father owned a very rare gem that the high priest and the Kohanim wanted to purchase for the holy temple for the breastplate of the Kohen Gadol. And when they came to Dama's house to buy it, he said the key to this safe where it's kept is under my father's pillow. He sleeps with it. And my father's sleeping and I can't awake him. So therefore I can't sell it to you. And he turned them away. And the Talmud said, this is the measure of honoring your father and mother, that he wasn't willing to wake up his father, even for a great prophet. The Talmud says that God rewarded him that a year later, his herd gave birth to a red heifer, which the Kohanim needed for the red heifer ceremony. And they came and they bought it for that amount of money that they would have given him for the precious gem. And the question is, God wanted to reward him for honoring his father, but why with a red heifer? And one of the explanations is that he treated the most logical commandment like a super rational commandment. You see, honor your father and mother is the most rational, logical, sensical commandment. Your father and mother gave birth to you, brought you into this world, raised you. Of course, you owe them a debt of gratitude. A chok is a commandment we can't understand. Mishpatim are the rational commandments. Honoring your parents is super rational. But when it came to waking his parents, he didn't try to rationalize or justify it or come up with, excuses why it may be okay to wake up his father. But rather he said, honor your father and mother. I will not awaken my father. I don't care how much money I'm going to lose. And that's why he was rewarded with a red heifer, to teach him and to demonstrate that that's the reward he got, because he treated the most rational commandments like a super rational commandment. And this is one of the important lessons of the chok, the super rational commandment. That the danger of rational, when I don't know the reason for something, someone says, don't touch that button. I'm not telling you why, but don't touch it. You're not even going to think about it because you don't know what that button represents, the harm, the danger. So you'll be careful. But if I tell you the reason for something, now you feel like, oh, I know the reason. So if I could come up with an explanation why this is an exception to the rule, I may do it. So the Torah says, no, even the most simple, rational commandment, don't start justifying things or excusing things or rationalizing things. Because that's what people do when they do the wrong thing. They justify it and rationalize it and convince themselves that in this situation it's okay, or there's a reason why I can do it. And therefore the Torah says, no, all the commandments have to be like a chok. There's a story told about a king who was discussing with another king how loyal his subjects are and his soldiers. And he said, my soldiers obey everything I tell them to do, to the T. So they made a bet. The other king said, send me one of your soldiers and give him instructions. And let's see if I could get him to disobey your instructions. And they made a bet, let's say for 10,000 gold coins. He said, there's no way you're going to get my subject, my soldier, to disobey my instruction. And he says, okay, I'll bet you 10,000 that I can. So he sends him to the other king with some kind of message to deliver something. When the other king sees the soldier, he says, how you doing? He says, by the way, I notice you're a hunchback. What's wrong with your back? The soldier says, I'm not a hunchback. I'm perfectly fine. He says, yes, you are. You're a hunchback. He says, no, I'm not. He says, I'll bet you 5,000 gold coins that you are a hunchback. Take off your uniform. Oh, I'm sorry. I left out an important thing. The king told the soldier, don't take off your uniform when you're on my official duty. And the other king made a bet that he could get him to take off his uniform. So he says to him, you're a hunchback. He says, no, I'm not. He says, I'll tell you what. I'll give you 5,000 coins. I'll prove to you. I'll make a bet that you are a hunchback. Take off your uniform. We'll look at your back and see if you're a hunchback. So the soldier says, I know the king told me not to take off my uniform, but here, I know I'm not a hunchback. I'll get 5,000 gold coins. I'll bring it back to my king. He'll be happy that I made him 5,000 gold coins. So sure enough, he rationalized it and took off his uniform, even though he was told not to. And he proved that he was not a hunchback, and he got to 5,000 gold coins. When he came back to the king said, did you do what I told you to do, not to take off your uniform? He says, no, because he told me I'm a hunchback. I proved him. I said, I am not. He said, I'll bet you 5,000 gold coins. So I knew I was not a hunchback. I figured I'll make you 5,000 gold coins for the king. So I took off my uniform, and here's the 5,000 gold coins. And the king said, oh, you fool. I bet him 10,000 gold coins that you wouldn't take off your uniform. You actually lost me 5,000 gold coins. And the point is that we have to realize that even the most rational commandments come from an infinite God. And while there are aspects of the commandment that we understand that make perfect sense, there are higher levels of spiritual meaning to every commandment. And therefore, even if we think there's a justification or rationalization, I think Albert Einstein said, when it comes to rationalization, every person is a genius, right? So therefore, you have to realize that there should be absolute obedience to the commandments of Hashem, and not try to think that we can make exceptions to the rule based on our own justification and rationalization. So that's the opening commandment about the para aduma, the red heifer. Now we're going to turn to the second episode of this week's Torah portion, which is chapter 20 of the book of Bamidbar. And this is one of the most famous stories. Again, the Jewish people come complaining to Moses. Now, why do they come complaining to Moses? Because there's no water. Why is there no water? Because here we have it. The Jewish people come, it says in chapter 20, to Moses, and there was no water to drink, and they clamor against Moses and Aaron, and they say, we're dying of thirst, we need water. Why did you bring us into this desert to die and our flock to die? Why did you take us out of Egypt to this place? There is no fig or grape or pomegranate, no water to drink. And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the congregation to the entrance of the tent of meeting and fell on their faces, because once again the Jews are complaining and losing hope and faith. But why was there no water? So it says right here why. The Jewish people came to a place called Kadesh, and Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, died. And she was buried there. She was buried in the desert. And we know that there were 3 constant miracles in the desert that accompanied the Jewish people. There was the clouds of glory for protection. That was in the merit of Aaron. There was the water from the rock, which is in the merit of Miriam. And then there was the manna in the merit of Moses. Miriam died, the water ceased to flow. And here we come to one of the most famous stories. God says to Moses, take your staff and gather the nation, you and Aaron, and speak to the stone, to the rock, and it will produce water, and you'll give the congregation to drink and the flock. But what happens? Moses takes the staff before God as he was commanded. And Moses and Aaron gathers the congregation to the face of the rock. And he says, listen up, you rebels. Am I going to draw water? Shall we bring forth water for you from this rock? And then Moses raised his arm and struck the rock with his staff twice, and abundant water came forth, and the assembly and the animals drank. And now God says, Moses, because you failed to sanctify my name amongst the Jewish people, you will not enter into the land of Israel, but rather you will die in the desert and be buried here without going into the land of Israel. We all know that Moses pleaded to go into the land of Israel, and God let him go up on the mountain and see the land, but not enter into the land. And that's why Martin Luther King said in his last address, I've seen the promised land. I may not enter in there, but you will go in there. So too, he was echoing the words of Moses, that I cannot go into the promised land, but you will go into the promised land. And there are a lot of questions on this story, as you could imagine, but the most famous question is, why did God deny him entry into the land of Israel? What was the terrible sin? Okay, he struck the rock, but for that he gets punished that after 40 years of shepherding the Jewish people through the desert, taking them out of Egypt with 10 plagues and miracles and representing God and defying and challenging Pharaoh, for striking a rock, he gets such a punishment? Seems a little harsh. And furthermore, why did God tell him to take the staff with him if he wasn't supposed to hit the rock? Why take your staff and go speak to the rock? And third of all, 40 years ago, when Moses brought the Jews into the desert, there was also a lack of water. And there God said, take your staff and strike the rock. So why here is it a sin to strike the rock when initially it was what God wanted him to do, to strike the rock? So these are some of the famous questions. And one very famous answer to this question, to at least the question of what was the sin of Moses, was that it wasn't the hitting of the rock that was the sin. It was the loss of his temper, the anger that Moses displayed. He hit the rock out of anger because he said to the people, listen up, you rebels. Am I going to draw water from this rock? And he struck the rock in anger twice. And that's when God said, you cannot lead the Jewish people because you have shown anger. And as a leader, you can never lose your temper or show anger. You have to understand the plight of your people and never lose your composure. And therefore, the sin is not striking the rock, the sin is anger. And this is something we know, that it says whoever gets angry, it's like they serve idolatry, because they're obviously not trusting in God at that moment. They're getting angry because they're feeling they should be the ones controlling the situation. And again, Moses was on a very high level, so more was expected of him. And for him to lose his temper and strike the rock out of anger was considered a lack of sanctifying God's name properly. So at least the Rambam Maimonides gives a little more context to understand the sin. But the question is, this is not the first time Moses was provoked by the Jewish people. Why now did he lose his temper? And one explanation is that, how did the story start? It started that Miriam died in this place called Kadesh, and she was buried. It was the funeral of Miriam. And therefore, there was no more water. And so perhaps the reason why Moses lost his temper was because we all know, when do we lose our temper? When we're emotionally fragile, when we're at our wits' end, when our nerves are shot, and we're easily provoked because we're feeling fatigued, we're feeling on edge, we're feeling insecure. Moses was grieving over the passing of his sister, his only sister, and not just any sister. She's the sister who watched over him when he was in the Nile and saved his life. But more than that, the only reason he was born was because of his sister. As you all know, the Midrash, that his parents stopped procreating because Amram and Yocheved said, Pharaoh said, if a boy is born, it's going to be thrown in the Nile. We don't want to risk our baby boy being thrown in the Nile. And it was little Miriam who said to her parents, you're worse than Pharaoh, because Pharaoh only decreed death on the boys. By not having children, you're decreeing death on the boys and the girls. So it was in the merit of Miriam that he was born, because Amram and Yocheved, Moses' parents, reunited and had a baby. And then she watched over him at the Nile and met the daughter of Pharaoh and brought the baby back to the mother to be nursed. So he was very close to his sister. His sister meant everything to him. And now his sister dies, and now he's grieving. And now on top of that, the Jews are provoking him and saying, why did you take us out of Egypt to die with our flock in the desert? There's no figs, there's no pomegranates, there's no grapes. And he says, I can't take it anymore. And that's why he, so to speak, breaks down and loses his temper and strikes the rock. And it's not that God was punishing him. God was just saying, you've demonstrated that you're no longer fit to be a leader, because you're at the end, you're losing your temper. And yes, it's difficult to be a leader. They say leadership is a lonely job. And Moses at least had his family, he had a sister, and now his sister's gone. And now everyone. So when the Jewish people provoked him and he had a sister to turn to, or his family members, he felt he was able to handle it. But now he wasn't able to handle it anymore. And therefore, don't see it as a punishment, but more of as God saying that you've run your course as a leader. Maybe it's time for someone else to take over the mantle of leadership. Another beautiful answer I saw given. I'll give you two other answers to this question of the sin of striking the rock. One is Maimonides, that it was anger. Another one was that just a very good insight, that what does Moses do? He rebukes them. He says, listen up, you rebels. Shall we draw water from this rock? In other words, he's calling them rebels. He's rebuking them. And then he strikes the rock. And I saw this insight that says, what he should have done is he should have produced the water first. And after he gave them to drink, that's when he should have rebuked them. In other words, rebuke them on a full stomach, so to speak, not on an empty stomach. Rebuke them when they quench their thirst, not when they're thirsting. In life, you could say the same thing, but the timing has to be the right timing. Sometimes you say the right thing at the wrong time, and it's as though you've said the wrong thing, because the person wasn't capable of hearing it because they weren't in the frame of mind. You have to say it when the recipient is able to absorb the message. While they're dying of thirst, you can't rebuke them. They're not going to be able to hear you. Give them the water, let them be satisfied, let them quench their thirst, and now you could reprimand them. But the order is what Moses' mistake was. But yet a third interpretation is that, you see, in the beginning of the 40 years, God said, take the staff and strike the rock. Why? Because that was a generation that came out of slavery. What does the slave know? The staff, the rod, the striking, the hitting, the beating. In other words, the way you deal with such a nation is with strength, with power. But this is a new generation, 40 years later, generation that was born in the desert, born in freedom, experienced only freedom. And therefore, what God was saying is, this generation, you can't use the staff. Rather, you have to speak to them. You have to communicate to them. It's sort of like a little child and a grown-up child. You know, a staff doesn't mean physical hitting. It means, this is what I said. This is what you must do. It's discipline. It's absolute. It's, top down. That works with a little child, perhaps. When you have a grown child, you have to communicate, you have to reason with them, you have to speak to them, you have to speak to their heart, you have to speak to their mind. And that's exactly the same idea here, that God was saying, Moses, that you're used to leading a generation that came out of slavery, symbolized by hitting the rock. The first time it was okay to hit the rock, because that was the generation that left slavery. But now it's a new generation. They need a leader that can speak to the rock, so to speak, not hit the rock. Now, in addition to Moses losing his sister in this week's Torah portion, he actually loses his brother too. We learn about the passing of Aaron the high priest. God says, oh, Aaron is also going to pass away. Now, why is Aaron passing away? Here we find something interesting. When it came to the story of the rock, it says the nation gathered to Moses and Aaron. And they said, why did you take us out? They complained against Moses and Aaron. And then Moses and Aaron gather the nation around the rock. And Moses says, listen up, you rebels, and strikes the rock. But then listen to the next verses. And God said to Moses and Aaron, because you failed to sanctify, you didn't believe in me to sanctify me in the eyes of Israel, the Israelites, by speaking to the rock. Therefore, you will not bring the nation in. Who is you? Moses and Aaron. Not only was Moses punished, but Aaron was punished. And it was decreed that he cannot go into the land of Israel. And the question is, what did Aaron do wrong? He didn't hit the rock. He didn't lose his temper. But we see that because Moses and Aaron gathered the people to the face of the rock, and Aaron was present and remained silent when Moses started yelling at the people and rebuking them and struck the rock in anger, he is complicit in it as well. He's the bystander who allows. And again, this is a very high level of accountability, but Aaron was expected to stand up and say something to Moses. And because he didn't, he's also condemned to have to die. And therefore, both of them are decreed to die. Before we get into the actual passing of Aaron, I just want to point out that there are other theories about the striking of the rock. And one is that later in the book of Deuteronomy, when Moses talks about the story of the spies, he says, and you came and you demanded that I send spies, and God was angry and said, you're going to have to wander for 40 years. That was the story of the spies from just 2 weeks ago. But there Moses says, and God got angry at me too and said, you too will not go into the land of Israel. The question is, was it the sin of the spies or the sin of hitting the rock that forfeited Moses' right to go into the land of Israel? And one answer is that it was really the sin of the spies and Moses' participation in that caused them not to go into the land of Israel. The same thing with Aaron, it was the sin of the golden calf. But God didn't want to record in the Torah that, because of that grave sin. So God, so to speak, like a little bit of a cover-up on Moses' reputation, Instead of saying because he participated in the mission of the spies, he couldn't go into the land of Israel, which is a grave sin, or Aaron because of the golden calf, God attached it to the sin of striking the rock, which is a very minor sin, to not reflect negatively on Moses and Aaron. So again, you see all the commentaries struggle with understanding this story of striking the rock. And the two stories of striking the rock versus speaking to the rock, I think it's also a metaphor for us and a message that there's certain rocks that have to be spoken to and certain rocks that have to be hit. There's a time to hit the rock and there's a time to speak to the rock. So if you look at geopolitics, right? There's certain enemies that you could sit down and talk and make a treaty and an understanding. You could speak to the rock and it could produce water. But then there's certain enemies, as we see today with Hamas, that speaking is not going to change anything. The only thing you can do is have a show of force and strength, and that is the only way to deal with this obstacle. So now going back to the passing of Aaron. I just want to tie all of this into Chukat. You know, we said the name of the Torah portion is Chukat. Chukat are the commandments that are super rational. And it started with the red heifer, which is when someone becomes contaminated by coming into contact with the dead. And death itself is super rational. Why is it that God made it that we have to return to the dust from where we come? Now, of course, we could go back to the Garden of Eden, and initially man was supposed to live forever, but because of the sin, but the whole concept of death, especially tragic deaths, is beyond our comprehension. And water represents Torah, that through Torah, through connection to God, we could be comforted and be able to grieve over the loss of loved ones. But here it is, in this week's Torah portion, Moses loses his two siblings, his entire family, basically. So Moses is the person that's grieving over his siblings, of the loss of his brother and his sister. And so and dealing with the super rational elements of life and death. And I just want to tie it back into Chukat in one other way. You know, the word chuk means super rational commandment. It's a statute. It's like a decree. But the word chok also means to engrave. You know, the 10 Commandments were engraved, chakuk, on the stones. What's the connection? The connection is that when you obey statutes, they become engraved in you. They become your habits. You know, someone said, watch your thoughts because your thoughts will become your words. Watch your words because your words will become your actions. Watch your actions because your actions will become your habits. Watch your habits because your habits will become your destiny. So just like there are bad habits, there are good habits, and your good habits that you engrave in your being. And the idea is that, you know, they talk about intellectual IQ and emotional intelligence, right? IQ is what you know, what you understand. But EQ is your emotions. Your emotions are much deeper. They're part and parcel of who you are. They're engraved in you. And what a person needs is not just IQ, but EQ, that it should be part of their very emotional fabric to do the right thing, to have the right attributes of compassion, of kindness, right? It should be not just that you understand intellectually that it's the right thing to be kind, but it's part of your EQ, your emotional intelligence. And that's the idea of chakuk, that it's the Torah becomes engraved upon your soul. It becomes part of who you are. And it's almost like something that's super rational. You don't even have to think about it. It's instinctual. It comes naturally to you. It's, in other words, beyond understanding. It comes from a deeper place than understanding. We always think that understanding is the highest part of a person, which it is, wisdom, understanding, intellect. But there's your essence, your soul, your core, you know, like a gut reaction from your kishkis, so to speak, right? That's something that even transcends understanding. And that's where it really has to come from. And that's the idea of chakuk, something that's engraved in your very being, in your very essence. And that's sort of like the water in the rock, right? On the outside, something may seem like it's a rock, but on the inside, there could be living fresh waters. And the idea is that even, and this is something that ties into the third day of Tammuz, the Rabbi His whole message was that every Jew has a pintel, a yid, a spark of godliness inside of them. And even if on the surface someone seems like a rock, they seem cold, they seem hard, they seem unreceptive and indifferent to Judaism, there's living waters inside that rock. There is the soul, their godly neshama, and therefore keep on speaking to that rock, so to speak. Don't give up on that rock. Don't think this Jew is too far gone. And there's countless stories of Jews who people thought, oh, this Jew is so irreligious. He's an atheist. He's this. He'll never observe Judaism. He'll never reconnect. And of course, we all know the stories over and over again, and they discovered that inner soul that maybe was dormant, that was lying beneath the surface. And I'll just give you one story about engraving letters that ties into this idea with the Rebbe, because again, today's the 30th yard site of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. But there was once rabbinical students who went on a mission. The Rebbe would send students around to spread Judaism in remote communities, and they came to a certain community, and they met a certain Jew, and they were talking about Judaism and observance, and he says, what brings you here? Are you here to raise money? And they said, no, we're not here to raise money. We're here to spread Judaism. And they said, who sent you? He said, the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And they said, well, why does the Rebbe care about Jews all over the world? I understand if he cares about Jews in his own community, why does he care about Jews all over the world? And they said to the man, do you know what a Torah scroll is? And he said, yeah, of course I know what a Torah scroll is. They said, a Torah scroll has 300,000 letters, but what happens if one letter is missing? The entire Torah is invalid. So they said to this man, every Jew is like a letter in the Torah scroll. Even if one letter is erased from the Torah scroll, the whole Torah is not kosher. So the Jewish nation is like one collective Torah scroll. Every Jew is a letter. If a Jew fades away, if a Jew assimilates and is lost from the Jewish people, the whole Torah is invalid. So the Rebbe is like the master scribe who wants to fill in all the letters that have faded or been broken. So the man said, wow, that's a beautiful explanation. Thank you. When they came back to New York, they wrote a report, as people would. And when they told the Rebbe the story, the Rebbe said, please contact this man and correct your analogy, because it's not correct. Why? So the Rebbe said that when you put ink on parchment to write a Torah scroll, the ink is the ink and the parchment is the parchment. They're two separate entities. You marry them by putting the ink on the parchment. But because they're not really one entity, the ink could be faded or scratched off or erased. But the Rebbe said a Jew and his Judaism, it's not a superimposed external thing. It's part of his essence. It's his identity. It's who he is. It's his fabric. It's his makeup. And therefore, the letters of the Torah are not a good analogy, because you can never lose your Judaism. You can never lose your Jewish soul. You can never lose your divine script on your soul. It's not like ink that could get erased or faded. Rather, the Rebbe said, give him the analogy of the Ten Commandments, where the letters were chiseled into the stone, engraved in the stone. When you have letters in a stone engraved, you can't even distinguish between the letter and the stone. The letter is the stone is the letter. It's part and parcel. It's one and the same. That's the Jewish soul. The Jewish soul is part of your being. You can never lose it. You can never be disconnected from it. What could happen, the Rebbe said, is that sometimes the stone can be covered with layers of foam or filth or dirt, and the letters are no longer legible. They're not visible because they're covered up. They're there beneath the surface, but they're covered up with other things, debris. But you don't have to rewrite the letters. You just have to clean it off and reveal the letters that are already present. So too, the Rebbe said, the Jewish soul is ever present. And that was really, talk about today, the Rebbe's message. If you have to condense the message of the Rebbe to a bumper sticker, it's ignite the souls of the Jewish people. Every Jew has a soul. You have to take the fire of Torah and ignite it, and then it will burn brightly. Famous story that there's a famous book called The Prime Ministers, written by Yehuda Avner, and he was once he writes in the book that he was at an audience with the Rebbe, and he asked the Rebbe, he says, your Hasidim say you perform miracles, is that true? And the Rebbe said, no. So he said, what's your role as a Rebbe? He says, my role as a Rebbe is it says the candle of God is the soul of man. The Rebbe says, what is a candle? A candle is a lump of wax with a thread running through it. So too, every person has a wax, which is their body, which goes down with time as it burns, right? Lifespan. But there's a thread that goes through the core, which is the soul. But the Rebbe said a candle is not a candle till you take a fire and kindle the flame, right? If you walk into a candle store, they have lots of candles, but that's not what a candle does, sit on a shelf. The idea of a candle is to create light, to create warmth. And therefore, unless you take the fire and kindle the candle's wick, it's not really a candle. So too, the candle of God is the soul of man, but we need to take the fire and the passion and the love of Judaism and ignite the soul of man to burn brightly. So when they finished his audience, he asked the Rebbe, so the Rebbe said, my job is to kindle the flames of the souls of the Jewish people. That's my mission. So when he finished the meeting, he said to the Rebbe, did you kindle my flame? And the Rebbe said, no, but I gave you the match, meaning I empowered you to light your own soul. Ultimately, we have to kindle our soul, but the Rebbe gives us the matches, the Torah, the wisdom, the inspiration to kindle our own flames. So that's the whole message of the chok, right? That every Jew has a soul, and there's water inside every rock, and it's engraved in our DNA spiritually. We get it as an inheritance from our ancestors, and that was really the Rebbe's message and life's mission. But going back to the story of Aaron, Aaron's death is very unique. He's told to go up on the mountain, and he's not going to go into the land of Israel because of the sin of the water, the rebellious waters. And Moses is told to take off the priestly garments of Aaron, the vestments, and dress Elazar, his son. And Aaron is going to pass away there. And that's what happens. Aaron goes up. Moses takes off his priestly garments, puts it on Elazar, his son, and Aaron dies there on the mountaintop. And the nation of Israel weeps for 30 days for the passing of Aaron, 30 days of mourning. And a couple of things that are very interesting about Aaron's passing. The first one is that what's the last thing Aaron sees before he dies? He sees his son dressed in his priestly garments. He leaves the world knowing that his son is going to carry on his mission. And that's the blessing of Aaron's passing. Moses didn't merit that. His sons didn't succeed him. He wanted that his son should succeed him, but God said, no, Joshua will succeed. He's a more worthy disciple. But the high priest is passed on from father to son. And the message of Aaron's passing is that we have to make sure that our children are wearing our garments. And the priesthood continues until this very day. Another message about Aaron's passing is it says the entire house of Israel wept or mourned for Aaron for 30 days. By Moses, it says the nation of Israel wept, but it doesn't say the entire house of Israel. There's one extra word by Aaron, the entire house of Israel. And our rabbis tell us something beautiful, that the people wept for Aaron more than for Moses. Men and women cried equally for Aaron. Why? Because Aaron was renowned as a peacemaker, a lover of people. He would come and restore peace amongst husband and wife. Famous teaching, be like the disciples of Aaron, love peace, pursue peace, love mankind, draw them closer to the Torah. Aaron embraced everyone with love. And we all know if he saw two people quarreling, or husband and wife, he would try to make peace amongst them. And sometimes he say, your husband really wants to work it out. Your wife wants to work it out. He would bring them back together. And therefore, he was more beloved even than Moses. Moses was a much greater leader. But Aaron was the peacemaker, the lover of mankind, the lover of people. And therefore, the men and the women cried equally, as opposed to by Moses, mostly the men, not so much the women. And again, I'm thinking about the Rebbe today, a person who's beloved by men, women, and children because of his love, tireless efforts and dedication and love for the Jewish people. But this is the way Aaron passes away. And the mourning for Aaron is even greater than the mourning for Moses. Chapter 21 is the sequel or the aftermath of the passing of Aaron. right after Aaron dies and the weeping of 30 days, it says the Canaanite king of Arad, who dwelled in the south, heard that Israel had come by the route of the spies, and he went to attack the Jewish people. And Rashi explains why is it right after the passing of Aaron? And Rashi says because he saw that the Jews were vulnerable, because after Aaron died, the clouds of glory, the protection was no longer there. And he said, now I could attack. And the idea, of course, is that our enemies are always looking for an opportunity to attack us. The minute they sense weakness and vulnerability, that's when they pounce. And therefore, we always have to make sure we project strength and that we have strength so that our enemies know not to even attempt to harm us. I want to talk about one other amazing story, and there's a number of other amazing stories in this week's Torah portion. Believe it or not, there's a story about hostage taking in this week's Torah portion. If you want to look it up later, it's chapter 20, verses 1, 2, and 3, that the king of Arad, the Canaanite king, it's this story. After Aaron dies, the king of Arad comes and he takes a captive, takes a hostage. And the Jewish people take a vow to God and say, God, if you give this nation into our hands, we'll dedicate it, consecrate it to God. We won't take any of the booty, we won't take any of the booty. We won't loot. We'll give everything to God. And sure enough, they go to war and they defeat the Canaanites and redeem this hostage. And this is a very powerful story about the length and the extent going to redeem hostages, just like our IDF soldiers have done in the recent release of 4 of our hostages, and to go to whatever length or extent necessary, but to do it obviously for the right motives, out of love for our fellow man, for the innocent hostages, and dedicate it to Hashem. But finally, the amazing story of the serpents, the fiery serpents. And this is an amazing story because most medical organizations, ambulances, the symbol, and if anyone knows the name, you could type it in. I know Amy does a little research. The snake around the staff that you see on ambulances, on medical apparatuses, that is straight out of this week's Torah portion. It's an example of a biblical concept being used in modern day. And basically, the Jewish people were complaining again about the food. They weren't happy. And God sends fiery serpents to bite them. And many died. And then they come to Moses, they say, we're sorry, we sinned, we spoke against God and against you, pray to remove the serpents. And Moses prays to remove these serpents. And what does God say? God says, take a fiery serpent and put it on a pole and put it up in the sky, up in the air, and let them look up to this fiery copper serpent on the staff. And whoever was bitten will be cured. Now, the question is, since when is looking at a copper serpent on a staff a way to be cured? And the answer is that it wasn't the snake that cured, it was the looking up to heaven in prayer. And so when they looked up to heaven, the source of their punishment, and repented, that's the way they were cured. And this symbol has become the symbol of medical healing, because it was the serpent on the staff that healed the Jewish people from the snake bite. But it goes much deeper than this. First of all, it's amazing that when you have a vaccine, you take part of the venom of the snake, so to speak, or the illness, and you put it in the vaccine, and that's what heals. That's the way God made it in nature, right? How do you pronounce it? Caduceus. But why is it that you use the venom of the snake to heal from a snake bite? You got to look at the snake. And there's a very profound psychological message. And that is, we all get bitten in life by different challenges and struggles and hardships. And we have to realize that the cure is in the problem. Just like the venom of the snake cures, and a little bit of the illness, right, is what creates the vaccine, so to speak. The antidote sometimes is in the problem. The problem came your way. You were bitten by this because within that challenge, within that struggle, lies the answer, the solution. The reason you have a struggle in this area is because that's the area that you need to explore. And with overcoming this challenge, within that, you're going to find your redemption. You're going to find your healing and your cure. So instead of running from the snake, look at the snake. But don't look at it on the ground like a serpent that bites. Look at it on a staff from a heavenly perspective. Look at it from a sublime perspective. Look at it from, why did God send this challenge into my life? What am I meant to learn from this challenge? How am I meant to grow from this experience? You could look at the same snake on the ground, and then it bites you because you're looking down. You're not looking to God. You're not looking for answers. You're not looking for understanding. You're just looking at the problem. But the way to look at it is up in the heaven and say, why did God send this serpent my way? And many people will tell you in their personal life that it's precisely through the hardships and the suffering and the struggles that they discovered their true healing in life. Because within that serpent, when it's put up from a higher perspective, you're able to get the cure and the healing for the venom and the serpent's bite that you were struck with. So this is some of the amazing stories in this week's Torah portion and the eternal lessons that apply to all of our lives. And just one last thought I'm going to finish by is that, when the Jewish people traveled through the desert, they always said, they always wanted to pass through other nations in a peaceful manner. And they said, let us go through your nation. So, for example, in chapter 21, Israel sent messengers to Sichon, the king of the Amorites. We want to pass through your land. We're not going to go into your vineyards, into your fields. We're not going to drink your water. We're going to go on the right path. We want to just pass through in peace. But once again, the king of Sichon says, no, do not step foot in my territory. If you do, I'm going to come out and attack you. And that's what he did. But you do see that the Jewish people always were told to never use their force or strength to just confiscate land or territory or even fruit of the field or the vineyard, but always to respect the boundaries of other nations and never encroach and never interfere and never try to harm. Just look for safe passage. And unfortunately, they were denied that time and again. And we're going to see at the end of this week's Torah portion how the king of Bashan came out to attack the Jewish people. And God says to Moses, don't be afraid of him because I will deliver him into your hands. Even though he was a mighty warrior, God says, have faith, I will deliver him to your hands. And these are all timeless messages that the Jewish people just want to live in peace with their neighbors. We're not looking to take anything from anyone. But unfortunately, what happens time and again, the nations don't want to tolerate the Jewish people living in peace with them. They want to attack us like the nations in the desert did. And ultimately, we overcome because God delivers them into our hands. May it be so speedily in our day. Thank you all for joining, and I wish you all a wonderful, terrific day.